In this video, we'll be covering the first part of Chapter 4, School and Educational Psychology for PSY 120, Careers in Psychology, Neuroscience, and Human Development. School and educational psychology as areas, and they are distinct areas. You'll learn that as we move our way through this chapter. School psychologists focus their attention on working with students who have learning differences, anxiety, other kinds of emotional problems, behavioral problems that they face in the school environment. A lot of school psychologists are involved in assessment and designing IEPs, individualized education plans, and so on. Educational psychologists, on the other hand, while there is some overlap in basic interests, educational psychologists help educators and schools and school districts understand how kids learn, how people learn, because their work, even though your authors talk about children, educational psychologists work in any kind of educational context, K through 12, higher ed, even education that takes place in industry. So it's broadly focused on the educational context. School and educational psychology are distinct fields. They have related contexts, such as schools, and related some related content, like the overlapping theories and so on. But they are very distinct fields in terms of what people are doing, how they're trained, and how they're licensed. Both focus on students, classroom interactions, learning, but school psychology is a clinical specialty. It's a practice-oriented field. So many of the things we talked about already in the last chapter about needing to get the appropriate degree from an APA-accredited institution and then seek licensure through your state, all of those rules still apply for a school psychologist. Educational psychology, on the other hand, is a research-based field. So you're more likely to find those folks in academic environments, in think tanks, in research institutes, and in government kinds of positions. So as we move through this chapter, we'll be kind of digging into those similarities and differences along the way. Starting with school psychology, it is a specialty area of clinical psychology, looking at students' psychological development, their psychological functioning, their educational development in a school setting. Over time, school psychology has become more and more focused on the assessment side of doing assessments on students and determining what their needs are educationally. Some of it can be assessment in order to create diagnostics, deciding what a student might be diagnosed with, that then leads to needing to design a specialized program to meet that student's personal needs and their academic needs in a school setting. School psychologists are trained both as clinicians and they're also trained in education. So you can't create an educational plan for a student, say, with ADHD, if you don't have an understanding of educational theory, how education contexts work, how classrooms function, and so on. School psychologists work with kids, they work with families, they work with school districts. Their overarching goal is supporting the academic, social, emotional, behavioral needs of kids and adolescents in a school setting. It's less likely that you're going to see school psychologists practicing specifically with college students, so after high school graduation. More often, school psychologists are going to be focused on the K through 12 context. Since this is a clinical specialty, practicing school psychologists are going to be working in doing assessments and treatment services for kids and families, working with teachers and school officials as treatment plans are deployed. They may also be brought in as consultants to create programs, to evaluate programs, to do research, and promote health and welfare in the school setting. So there's both direct treatment provision or direct service provision, as well as that research and development in an applied setting. Some work to directly help families, teachers, and educational organizations to deal with problems, to resolve those problems, um, as they're working to make kids be as successful as they can be. Most school psychologists are going to work in a school district, although I've seen a trend in recent years where most school districts that are moderate to small size have to share, or they contract out. So I'm starting to see a lot of school psychologists who are in private practice who contract with schools. So they're not employed by the school system, but they're contracted year to year to provide assessment and IEP kinds of related services to kids within their district. Or they're just completely private practice and parents and families seek them out. They may also be found in clinics, medical centers, other kinds of facilities, and or in private practice. The typical kinds of issues that school psychologists are going to be dealing with, looking at, the usual suspects, the things that a lot of kids have trouble with, which is transitions, anxiety, depression, trauma, developmental issues, learning differences, and so on. They're often involved in doing assessment and identification of the nature of a particular behavioral issue. They may be involved in crisis intervention. So let's say that there is a death in the school. The school psychologist may be brought in order to help coordinate the response to that crisis. They may study all kinds of things, if they're research oriented, or if the school wants to do some data collection to figure out the impact of certain variables like food insecurity, housing insecurity, neighborhood climate, and so on. They may involve the school psychologist as a consultant in that context. They will assist the school in understanding family relationships, family transitions, and how that can affect learning. They may be involved in the development and assessment, evaluation of prevention programs like bullying prevention, violence prevention, conflict resolution, resiliency, those sorts of training programs for students and staff and parents. They may be involved also in doing diagnostic work, so diagnosing depression, anxiety, other kinds of issues, as they can impact, often dramatically, how kids are developing, how they're learning, and how they perform academically. Now, shifting to educational psychology, as I mentioned before, educational psychology is more of an academic, research-oriented field. It's not a clinical applied field. Educational psychology is the study of how people learn in educational settings. So there's a great deal of emphasis on cognition, emotion, social interaction, behavioral influences on learning. The goal for most educational psychologists is that the work that they do, the research that they do, can enable teachers, schools, systems to promote higher levels of learning. They may be involved in developing instructional techniques and assessing whether those instructional techniques are working. They may look at the nature of the school environment and how to improve that environment to increase the level of educational success. The theory on which educational psychology is based, it's a mixture. It's a mixture of basic psychology, like in cognition and learning theories, but also educational theory. So it's very much a hybridization of professionals working in both psychology and education. As I've said a couple of times now, it's a research field. So it's really the study of the science of learning and instruction. What educational psychologists are often engaged in doing is creating, testing out, assessing, and then changing evidence-based instructional practices, and then training educators and administrators how to use them, and how to turn that around into improvements in student academic success as well as meeting their developmental needs. Educational psychologists may be involved as consultants, working with educators, parents, policymakers. They may also be pure academics. They may be working in colleges and universities, teaching, and doing independent research. Typical topics that educational psychologists are interested in, and you'll notice some overlaps with what school psychologists may be interested in studying from a research perspective. They're going to look at effectiveness of different ways of providing instruction. They're going to look at mental health impacts in school settings. Everything from, what was the impact of going completely remote during COVID for students in terms of their learning and development? What kind of designs and instructional strategies are the most effective, and for what kind of students? How can we modify classroom environments to improve the nature of the interactions between two teachers and students, between students and students? How does it impact classroom management and so on? They may study things about students with learning differences, looking at learning disabilities, giftedness, other kinds of requirements that students with different needs might have. A lot of educational psychologists are really involved in developing assessment techniques, assessments for specific things, everything from reading ability to assessing the effectiveness of a program, of an instructional program. Some may be really interested in looking at various demographic variables that can have an impact on educational outcomes. And in that case, you're bringing in sort of an additional theoretical set of influences coming from sociology. So what are some of the opportunities with a bachelor's degree? If the kinds of questions that school and educational psychologists are asking kind of resonate with you, what are some of your opportunities with a bachelor's degree without seeking an advanced degree? Well, one of the opportunities is to become a teacher. Being an early childhood educator or preschool teacher is something that someone with interest in these areas could do with a bachelor's degree. And in fact, in some cases, you can work in that environment without a bachelor's degree, but it's becoming more and more and more required that people have at least a bachelor's degree, in some cases certification. So you need to keep an eye on specific requirements for jobs that are being offered in these areas. Early childhood educators are going to work in preschools, so before kindergarten age. They may also work in school readiness programs, helping kids get ready for admission into formal education. Preschool teachers do more than just sort of babysit, because sometimes my students will come in with a preconceived notion about what daycare looks like, what preschool looks like, not really understanding that there's daycare where they're just taking care of kids, keeping them busy while their parents are at work, versus early childhood education, where actual educational objectives are being met that are age appropriate for kids based on their development. Preschool teachers can create educational programs and materials, as well as social programs that support cognitive and as well as socio-emotional development. They're going to use a lot of different educational techniques, that are age appropriate, that involve building some of the prerequisite skills for reading, for behaving appropriately in a classroom environment. They'll do a lot of play, educational play, using media to help develop creativity and so on. They'll also provide kids with lots of opportunities to interact with each other. So a lot of what's going on is socio-emotional skill building. So conflict resolution, learning to share, learning to take turns, and so on. And also, there's big part of this that involves communication between the early childhood educator and parents. So, if the early childhood educator is noticing some consistent challenges and problems, they're going to communicate with the parents about how to meet those challenges, how to address them, and keep the child growing and developing on time. There's also the option of becoming an elementary or secondary educator, aka a teacher, which requires a bachelor's degree from an accredited program. Elementary school teachers provide instruction K through 5 or 6-ish. It depends on the district and how they define those boundaries. Then middle school, elementary K through 5 or so. Middle school can sometimes be defined in a district as 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th. Sometimes it's just 7th and 8th. Sometimes it's 6th, 7th, and 8th. It's a little confusing. Secondary educators are considered middle school and high school teachers. So depending on where those breakdowns are, and a lot of colleges, you can get an early childhood degree, you can get a primary or elementary degree, you can get a degree specializing in middle childhood or high school. And they all vary a little bit in terms of what's required. Middle school teachers, it's typically grades 6 through 8, but some schools break things down a little further. High school teachers is typically grades 9 through 12. So how do you become a teacher? Becoming a teacher requires that you get a bachelor's degree in education. Now, for high school teaching, that tends to be a little more subject matter tethered. So, for example, if you want to become a high school science teacher, you're going to get a bachelor's degree in a science like biology or chemistry. And then you will also take education courses in that domain so that you can become qualified to get your teaching license, to get your teaching certification. But for K through 12 and early childhood, it's a degree specifically in education. Middle and high school teachers, as I just mentioned, often specialize in a subject matter area. Some colleges do offer intensive programs, 1-year programs, for people who want to pivot and move from the work that they've been doing in a specific subject matter area and then become certifiable as teachers. And part of the goal of offering these kinds of programs is to meet the need. In some areas of the country, there are dramatic shortages of available teachers for a whole host of reasons that we don't need to get into here. But there has been a call for trying to find more flexible ways to get qualified people into K through 12 teaching positions. To become a teacher, you do have to pass a state licensing or certification exam, and it does vary state to state how that process looks and how it rolls out. In some cases, taking courses or taking a minor in psychology is helpful. In some cases, it's required. Now, universities are going to differ in terms of how the psychology content is delivered to students. More and more education programs teach all of their courses as a part of their program. At some universities, though, say an education major is going to be required to take developmental psychology either child and adolescent psychology or lifespan development as a part of their training. They're often required to take an educational psychology course. Now, it varies from one university to another. Who's teaching that? Is it faculty in education or is it faculty in psych? So it varies. At Mount Union, for example, we have a lot of education majors who are psychology minors because they're just interested. But their core courses, even in areas that could be offered in a psych program, are delivered through the education department. So it varies a little bit. Secondary school teachers, it's going to be useful for them to have a grounding in the study of adolescence and middle childhood, studying puberty, peer influence, risk-taking, and so on. Special education teachers, which there should be a special place in heaven for those individuals. Special ed teachers do the same sorts of activities as other kinds of teachers, but their focus is going to be on kids with learning differences, who have developmental disabilities, learning disabilities, and so on. And in some cases, behavioral issues that make it difficult for students to be successful in the classroom. They may assist teachers in other areas in identifying kids with specific educational needs. So they may be involved in sort of that process of saying, here's a child who appears to be struggling. Are there needs that this child might have that require specialized services? And the special education teacher may participate, for example, in helping to develop individualized education plans or 504 plans for those children. These are teachers that typically work as a team, and they're going to be highly involved with parents, with teachers in other domains like subject matter teachers, school counselors, school psychologists, in order to make sure that individualized education programs meet the needs of students as they are working their way through their school years. IEPs are detailed plans and they have legal significance. So if an IEP is put into place, the school has to live by it. So like, let's say that an IEP requires that students be given additional time to complete an exam, or maybe they require a quiet, private environment to take an exam or a test. Perhaps they require special software. Say you have a child with a visual disability, making sure that they have access to textual materials that are presented to them in an auditory format. If you have a child, conversely, who has a hearing difference, making sure that they have, if they are using signs, that they have an interpreter who can work with them. If they are hearing impaired, making sure that their equipment that they have for ensuring that they can hear what they need to hear, making sure that that equipment is made available and that it works properly. These are also teachers who may be involved in changing the instructional environment so that each student, based on their IEP, has their needs met. So they're going to be heavily involved in monitoring student progress, recording observations, updating parents, meeting with IEP teams to adjust what they're doing from year to year. They're going to be using techniques that they've learned in their education to modify behavior, to address problem behaviors in the classroom. They'll often be collaborating with other people, other teachers in their school, with counselors, with psychologists, with parents to troubleshoot, to develop long-range planning, and so on. So what does it take to become a special education teacher? It requires, a specific bachelor's degree in special education, and then supervised teaching plus passing a licensure exam or certification exam. Some states are moving in the direction of requiring a master's degree in special education. So that's something you'll want to look at if this is an area that you're interested in pursuing. You may want to look at, what states do you plan on living in, or are you thinking about living in, and what are their requirements for being a special education teacher. Another area is ESL teachers. So these are individuals who teach English as a second language. As the United States continues to be a place where multiple languages are spoken, there will be a need for people who can teach ESL and help students who are moving into English language dominant environments to to develop language skills that will enable them to be successful. They tend to work with non-native English speakers, and that's independent of age. So you can have adults who come to the United States with no English or limited English speaking and reading skills, and they may work with an ESL educator in order to improve their skills, to increase their likelihood of achieving educational goals, but also workplace goals as well. ESL teachers are involved in teaching reading, writing, conversational skills, and improvement of communication skills. As I mentioned earlier, that helps people to be more successful in school, in work, and in the community. These are teachers who need to be pretty flexible. They may or may not have highly specific language skills, and that often surprises people. But what they do need to be aware of is they need to be able to quickly adjust and adapt and be open to students from different backgrounds, different cultural systems. They need to be flexible so that they can adapt to and understand their various students. For example, there was a period, I don't know, about 10, 15 years ago, where there was a big influx of immigrants from Somalia, and they came into parts of Ohio, in particular in Columbus. And right away, there was a high demand for ESL teachers to meet the needs of that community, so that they could be more fully integrated into work, into school. It wasn't just the kids, it was also the adults who needed that sort of bridge to help them become more successful. These are also people who, even though it's not part of what their license is, they often become a bridge for individuals that they're teaching. They often become informal, as your authors put it, mentors, advisors, and liaisons. And they may find themselves being that person who people go to connect them with other kinds of services. Teachers of all kinds often find themselves in these hybridized roles where they're providing meaningful connections and advice and support to people in their communities. But ESL teachers, that's going to be, in a particular way, because they're dealing with, a fairly vulnerable population. When you have people who don't speak English in an English-dominate culture, getting them to have some baseline English skills is going to be really, really critical to their ability to be successful and independent. There's also teaching assistants. Teaching assistants in the K through 12 environment means that these are people who support teachers, certified teachers, licensed teachers in the work that they do. They may be an aide to a teacher in a classroom. I know a couple of people that I volunteer with who are teaching aides who work in classrooms that have a high density of kids with learning differences. So the teaching assistants and teaching aides may be paired up one-on-one with a particular student, or they may have 4 or 5 students that they are working with to assist the teacher. So a teacher may have a classroom of 20 kids with special needs, for example. They may have a teaching assistant who helps them to do management, to perform basic instructional activities under supervision of their teacher. Common tasks, record keeping, attendance, grading, one-on-one and small group work, preparation of materials, monitoring behavior, and so on. This gives people, being an assistant can give people the chance to have a really big impact on individual children without a lot of the additional responsibilities that teachers have, like lesson plan development and continuing education. In some cases, people do this kind of work full-time. In some cases, they do it part-time as a way of, being involved in their school environment. Another avenue is early childhood behavioral specialists. This is if you compare it to being a K through 12 or preschool teacher, early child behavioral specialist, it's a somewhat newer career path. These are individuals who specialize in developing behavioral interventions. So they're typically focused on kids who are young, so under 7, who are have a developmental disability. They're behind in terms of developing specific education-related skills, maybe reading, as an example. Perhaps they have behavioral issues causing disruptions, impulsivity, other sorts of disabilities. So, for example, your authors give the example of autism. If you have a child under the age of 7 who has moderate to severe needs, autism, that early childhood behavioral specialist is going to work with the team of other educators to design interventions. So let's say you have a kid with autism who has meltdowns that are very disruptive for that student, but also for other students in the school, and are difficult for the teacher to manage and still be able to enact their lesson plans. So the early childhood behavior specialist would come in and do an observation, do some documentation, and then work with the teacher to implement a plan to work on that behavior so that it becomes less likely. These are often people who work as part of an IEP team, developing plans and strategies, reviewing them, adjusting them to manage behaviors that interfere with learning. And we're not just talking about autism. There's going to be all kinds of learning differences, behavioral differences, and so on. These are individuals who need to be well-versed in child development, particularly early childhood development that involves social, emotional, cognitive, and other kinds of domains that are a critical part of development. They'll also need the educational background in early childhood intervention. And that area, that second part of it, early childhood interventions, when you dig under the hood, it's a mixture of learning theory, educational theory, psychological theory that goes into building these kinds of approaches. For entry-level jobs, a bachelor's degree is required. In some cases, there are recommendations for masters, but I'm not seeing a real strong trend in that area. There is a child development associate credential that can be acquired as well. That's something you can look into. There's a website that is identified in your chapter if you're interested in it. It's not required, but some colleges offer courses that help students get through the credentialing process for becoming an early childhood behavior specialist. Another area that you can move into as a bachelor's degree holder is becoming an academic advisor. In some most colleges and universities, they're going to have professional people who function as advisors. Now, in a lot of colleges and universities, Mount Union included, faculty serve as academic advisors. But big universities with big programs, they're often going to have, and some small universities as well, they're going to have professionals whose only job is to do academic advising, which means, helping students understand what their requirements are, what their options are, and helping them make decisions as they navigate their way through their academic career. These are individuals who are going to provide guidance on course selection, help students keep track of their degree requirements, registration, and update them on academic policies and changes to those policies. They will also be tasked with monitoring how students are progressing toward their degrees, and helping them to stay on track. Academic advisors can also become involved in directing students to other resources that may be helpful for them, like getting tutoring, getting career counseling, other kinds of services as well. They can help students to solve academic issues that they're having. They may be a bridge between students and faculty. If the faculty are not providing advising directly to their students, the academic advisor is going to sometimes help negotiate solutions between students and faculty when there are particular problems that students are facing. They may also be providing career advising and some degree of personal support. Now, as I said, it varies from university to university who the academic advisor is. At Mount Union, we have faculty primarily providing that service. At one of my kids, at their school, they have advisors who are responsible for certain majors. And these are not faculty in those departments. These are bachelor's holding individuals. They're hired specifically for the purpose of learning the curricula and helping students to navigate their progress toward graduation. Another area, and I've had several students actually go in this direction after they graduate with their bachelor's degree in psychology. It's probably more than a couple. It's quite a few who start, their first job out of college is as an admissions counselor at a university or college. And what admissions counselors do is to help students to navigate the process of getting into college. And, frankly, they're part of the marketing strategy of a college or university. When you are a high school student, you go for a college visit, the people that you meet with first are going to be the admissions counselors. They're going to talk to you about what the school offers, what its benefits are, the goodness of fit between the student and the programs that are being offered by that university. So they're definitely going to be involved with directly interfacing with students and their families to see if the university is a good fit for them. But they're also internally going to be working with the marketing program to develop some strategies for making the school more visible and more attractive to potential students. They may be involved in recruiting, in direct recruiting, like going to high schools, going to college fairs, and other kinds of recruiting events. They may be involved in campus tours, admissions events, outreach programs. They may be involved in applicant reviews, although a lot of that process is becoming automated. You'll still have admissions counselors who may be doing, direct sort of evaluations and interviews with prospective students. And this can help, the admissions staff to make decisions about accepting students into programs. They can also provide very detailed information and answers to questions, or they can direct prospective students to the appropriate offices to get their questions answered. They may be answering basic questions about financial aid, but again, they may then connect that prospective student with the appropriate office for getting their questions answered. Finally, they often become a bridge for setting people up to be alumni. So they may work with their prospective students, to understand that there is a whole universe of former students and current students that they can use as supports. And that can be a recruiting tool for admissions counselors. And that concludes my coverage of the first part of Chapter 4.